Hello everyone, today we talk about Italian maritime republics, which I noticed I never touched as a topic on Schwerpunkt, and although I've been discussing extensively chiefly the Mediterranean trade during especially the Low Middle Ages, and looking at these principalities, these republics as you want to call them, in the period, today we will look essentially at the period of maximum, well, not even a maximum expansion, but of the moment of the rise. So not even specifically the origins, they are also equally very fascinating, and I hope I will deal with them sometime, but really looking how they developed in the first place. And it's a very introductory video, it's not really a big much, but I hope that it's gonna be interesting. I realize every time I make a video about Roman history, I get hundreds of views, and do something about the Middle Ages, nobody gives a damn, essentially, and this kind of saddens me, although I know, people in general are more interested about certain topics, but these ones are particularly interesting in my opinion, exactly because they are kind of overlooked and kind of say, okay, this is not important because maybe either it happened in the Middle Ages, or maybe because people think these were kind of small entities of some sort, or just because, I don't know, they were in Italy, and also, I don't know, because of the linguistical distance there is no great interest in the region, or I don't know. Actually, it's plenty of factors that lead to this unfortunate lack of interest towards medieval history in general, and one of my, probably my greatest objective on Schwerpunkt at this very moment is to revive, perhaps, by putting this kind of hundreds of videos online at this point, on the internet, to to offer at least a wider perspective, and to show how diverse and how big these systems really were. Even from a sheer historical point of view, if you study ancient history, you have, I don't know, for that event, I don't know, 3 or 4 sources, if you're lucky. About the Middle Ages, we have so much, and so much that is not already there, present, accessible, open-sourced, but also that has to be explored a lot once again. And especially about the Middle Ages, all this kind of differentiation, this kind of saying, oh, okay, this place had this own characteristics, and maybe another one was just next to it, it had others, some of which are completely different. I find it very fascinating, and I think it's difficult to learn the Middle Ages. It's really difficult. Even me, that now I've been studying it for several years, say in a more or less serious way, I sometimes stumble into things I completely ignored, and I realize how vast and objectively how it's impossible even to know in detail. But looking at these topics bit by bit, I think it's also in general, like today, like in general now on Schwerpunkt, I think it's very, very important. So starting with these Italian maritime republics, a great chapter objectively in medieval history. How did the whole thing start? I mean, weren't there cities there? How does it start? Well, we can start from around the year 1000. This completely arbitrary watershed we can identify, however, as a moment of revival of European economy, starting a bit everywhere, but also being fueled by these Mediterranean trades that were the, objectively the shifters of these great masses of wealth, and from east to west and vice versa, and that were contributing to make these local communities rise and to structure their power, their influence, and the whole thing really started mostly from, and this is often overlooked, from kind of the south of the peninsula. The most important Italian maritime republics in history eventually would become essentially in the north, or in the center, however you prefer them. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice were substantially the most important of these, although the very first ones, including Amalfi, this is also often recalled, were objectively from the south, and all these cities in the south had let's say, lots of things in common, actually. That was the fact that it had been Italo-Byzantine cities. So these weren't cities like others. These were coastal cities where the Byzantines had maintained, even just nominally sometimes, and most of the times at this point in the year 1000 nominally, a control of some sort. And these communities were, let's say, still tied to the Byzantine Empire for this very reason, because being situated on the sea and therefore being open to the Mediterranean, and being the Byzantine Empire objectively still a big power, a great market, and definitely a greatly profitable commercial partner, these cities maintain also a certain kind of political allegiance and interaction. Naturally, the reality was a bit more complicated than this, in the sense that, locally speaking, these cities were de facto not just autonomous, but almost completely independent. And especially now they were growing, now the area of the Mediterranean was undergoing now in these very centuries some substantial changes, some of which could be also very sudden, just like the Norman conquest that eventually, as we will see now, brought even to the decline of the southern Italian maritime republics. So that is why eventually these didn't make it to become anything like Genoa or Venice and so on. And that were kind of also involved into the relations with the local interland powers, terrestrial powers, and trying to essentially maintain their autonomy within these changes. For instance, at this time, southern Italy was still battled between essentially the southern Longobards, the Byzantines. Sometimes the Germanic emperors popped out trying to seize this area that ultimately they never managed to control, even when the Swabians managed, but this happened later naturally, when they managed to seize the Kingdom of Sicily through dynastic inheritance from the Normans. This remained kind of a unique thing on its own. So these cities were enjoying a great prosperity, also because of this very reason, that before the Norman conquest, this southern Italian area was still very fragmented, and they could carve their own space for expanding so much. And what is interesting about actually almost all the maritime republics at this point is that they were all about the sea. Their interest was not in the hinterland most of the time. I mean, as we've seen now, that they were pretty much interested in what was happening in the hinterland, but they didn't have necessity to expand in it. It was not profitable. The most profitable thing was to strengthen their own power as individual centers that were, as in this area, in this region of Europe, still fortified. There had been a great continuity with the Roman, also the Greek tradition, because especially these coastal centers of southern Italy had been massively influenced also by, most of them started as Greek colonies back as Hellenic colonies back in the ancient world. Greek was spoken at this point, in part because they weren't properly Greek communities, but the Greek presence was still pretty much there, and that's pretty obvious, especially when you wanted to trade with a largely Greek-speaking political entity like the Byzantine Empire at this point. And these were, let's say, you can realize what kind of levels of quality of life also and commercial capabilities these had reached compared to other areas of Europe that at least at this point were still quite rural, not very financial. They were still very primitive in many ways. And this is, excuse me, I drink a little bit. And this is also, excuse me, why sometimes I don't understand why these chapters in history are so overlooked, given that this Mediterranean area was objectively the most advanced at the time. You know, the greatest things that were happening in this point in between Europe and, you know, within Europe were definitely more important in these areas than what was happening elsewhere. Our mind gets polarized with these big, namely kingdoms and empires that existed out there that, however, had sometimes a relatively modest capability considering how big they were objectively. And if you look at these city-states, you look at them and say, wow, but these people lived in a completely different way. It was way more advanced, way more developed and dynamic, and also so deeply, as we've seen, intertwined with the whole international politics. And that could mean, really, at the time, it could be the kingmakers at this point, literally, because, you know, one city that sided with one power could really make all the difference in the strategical scenario. And therefore, these are important. Certain names that we've given, we said Amalfi. Before, Amalfi is on the Amalfi Coast. If you look at how it is located, you understand practically everything, because this is a region. This is an area with a lot of mountains in the hinterland, and the cities were, and there wasn't just Amalfi in this part, were practically framed between the sea and the mountain. So basically, even if they had wanted, they couldn't even expand in the hinterland. Later, we see that there were a few maritime republics that had some kind of a countryside in the hinterland, and also extended and fought in there. Other cities were Naples, Salerno, Gaeta, all cities that were tied to this essentially Byzantine tradition. They had been ruled by dukes, as were called, or princes that were essentially, in origin, the military governors in the area. A bit like in Rome as well. Practically all every area of Byzantine Italy was ruled a bit in sort of sense in this fashion originally. Then these communities had grown autonomous. You see it even with Rome. Rome was originally in this called Duchy of Rome. So it also didn't encompass the city in itself, but there was also, you know, a pretty big thing for medieval standards, but also the surrounding countryside. The same went for Ravenna, so on. The same for Venice, that at this point was only developing actually, and also was not the seat of a previous city. We will see it later. Let's go let's follow the order now. But that were all more or less, you know, framed into this in origin too. This is not true, however, fully true for Genoa and Pisa, that had another history. They also were in origin very important ports that also the Byzantines had held when they had reconquered Italy back in the 6th century, but these eventually had been seized practically by these land powers, the Longobards, the Franks afterwards, and now, however, also in there they were starting to enjoy a greater freedom given their position on the sea and participating also to the traffics. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So, by the 9th century, these cities minted their own coins, very importantly, which was a coin that derived from the Arab tari, not actually from the Byzantine coinage. This is a very important thing to see objectively, because it's true also monetary policy that we understand freaking a lot of things on the trade balance and all this stuff, and this shows that actually Islam, and not only Constantinople, was the privileged area of exchange of these cities. This is also very, very important. The relation between these cities and the Muslim world is very fascinating, also because it's older than just, you know, the idea that it's as if these cities had also developed in a moment to which great part of the Mediterranean was also Mediterranean trades were in the hands of the Muslim powers. And if you look at the Mediterranean, it doesn't matter who was who in religious terms, they always traded the one with the others. The Italians and the Jews were very active into this. They kind of made their fortune partly also through the alliance with the Saracen powers. There were Christian powers at this point that were allied with the Muslims, even maybe not openly against other Christian powers, because that also was kind of strategically inconvenient, but sometimes it happened, you know, that there was an active backing also of the Saracens. For instance, the Saracens could have not created their base in central Italy at the mouth of the Garigliano River if they hadn't been backed by centers like, I don't know, Gaeta, for instance. This obviously was intermittent, meaning that not always these powers were sticking together. Nobody actually liked each other. When you see these alliances, you have always to think it's sheer interest, as it's always been in history. And however, this makes you understand how, and this is normal, because in a politically fragmented situation, the balance shifts dramatically according to the situation. And this happened at all times. There were also great powers at a certain point were kind of closer to the Muslims, also sometimes in anti-Byzantine function than to other. And this has also to be understood, because there are certain narratives in history that today are literally crumbling into and disintegrating into pieces. That is the idea of, you know, the Christian versus Muslims in the Middle Ages in the Mediterranean. This is actually a very superficial and approximate interpretation at best, and it doesn't render the complexity of the political military situation in the Middle Ages, because it's not based on this. I realize there are many people who like to stress this perspective, this idea, you know, of accusing each other of, you know, kind of but I also have my interpretation. Sometimes they're not very I mean, I actually don't take sides ever, but I like to reflect also on who did what objectively, because that's also what history is about. And no, I'm not meaning I'm thinking that the Europeans were guilty because they made crusades. On the contrary, it was actually the Muslims who originated this invasion of an otherwise what had been up to that point a Christian lake like the Mediterranean. And this sea has been always, however, troubled by dynamics that went beyond religion. This is practically what the whole thing was about. And you can argue that every power was ruling at that point was not, a nice entity. There was a kind of lack, obviously, of what we consider today as, basic human rights. There was definitely a balance of some sort. I'm not saying that obviously these were necessarily bad or good powers in this sense, but they however had certain interests that went far beyond. It was all about themselves, very opportunistically, and this is how it's always been at all times in history. So let's go beyond and let's see how actually the thing worked in complex terms. In the case of these powers, as we were saying, the main area of development had been within the Byzantine orbit, and this is where Venice objectively was to raise from as the main maritime republic through the centuries. Venice had been born. Was kind of an exception in here because, differently from other Italian city-states, wasn't originated from a Roman city. We know also the history that also it is another myth that Venice was created during the barbarian invasions because people fled into the lagoons. So sure, we know that this happened, but the Venetian lagoons have been inhabited since prehistoric times. Were inhabited also in Roman times, so that's not really the point, and that's not also why Venice was born into the Middle Ages. These lagoons were very important because they were they had certain strategical advantages. They were difficultly, first of all, reachable, in the sense that even the Carolingians, for instance, when they invaded Italy, tried to seize these areas that were already pretty autonomous, but virtually had a Byzantine presence still in there. In fact, the so-called Doge in Latin comes in Italian comes not from the dux, from the duke, basically. And that was the Byzantine officer/governor that ruled in there. When you find dux, dukedom, and something like that, it's always because that was a land that in origin had a markedly military power, because the dux is the commander of the army. So these were kind of militarized regions, because obviously were regions of frontier, originally speaking. Venice as such develops very slowly. There were these series of islands, where also the modern city stands, that especially I think around the Rialto began to, let's say, to catalyze all this trade and absorbing. And there were other centers around. That area, that coastal area of the Adriatic Sea, northeastern Italy, has other marshy areas, lagoons. Another very important center was Comacchio, that also was much closer to the Po mouth than Venice and controlled originally these trades. Now, that the Po River at this point was one of the major arteries of European trade. At this point, it was basically where most of the goods came from the east into Central Europe, meaning the Po Valley, so close to the Alps, and these centers were developing very fast, and we're also in competition one with another. These were humble, actual villages in origin. Most of them were built on piling, on piles and stilts, just like Venice is still today. They had this great maritime vocation since the very beginning, and actually Venice was also a very aggressive power since the very beginning. It managed to knock out Comacchio from, naturally there are complex dynamics there. It's not just because Venice was particularly aggressive than others, but I'd say that they were favored with certain conditions, certain dynamics that brought eventually to the rise. And probably one of the greatest factors into the rise of Venice, probably the determining one, was this privileged relation with the Byzantine Empire in some way. Because it is true that Venice actually managed by itself, since an early age, to intertwine its, let's say, land-owning and commercial interests with agricultural and financial activities in this maritime impetus of immense range. But at the same time, it was favored by the fact that it had this privileged trade partner in Constantinople, to which they stuck till the very end, in the sense that Venice was the one that in 1204 eventually favored, together with during the Fourth Crusade, and actually brought to the together with other factors to the conquest of Constantinople itself by the Crusaders. It had kind of always stuck to the Byzantine Empire in one way or another. They had time of troubles. At a certain point, the Latins had been even massacred and imprisoned into the Byzantine Empire because the Italians were growing so pervasive, so invasive, let's say, in all the trade activities that there was this also in there. It's a very complicated thing. Maybe we'll explain it more in detail in another time. Let's say there were this kind of harsh feelings. Venice at that point, by the way, was already a considerable maritime power to be reckoned with. The Byzantine fleet now was kind of declining in favor of, during the 12th century, the Italian navies that at this point were practically ruling the Mediterranean. This is also another factor. Always to remember what Byzantine thalassocracy had been in practice, because the Byzantines had been the ones who had materially kept open these trade routes up to a certain point with the West, thanks also to their fleet. Now, Muslim piracy had been, as we've seen, pretty much out there, and especially in the Tyrrhenian Sea. So in this, also for these cities we mentioned before, the Italians were kind of more between the two things. So that's paradoxically, that's also how Arab piracy also favored in part the development of these Italian city-states, because if there had been an hegemonic thalassocracy, either from the Byzantines or the Saracens, these cities would have had more difficulties. Instead, this conflict also between the Byzantines and the Saracens eventually favored the rise of the Italian maritime city-states and gave them this opportunity of eventually crushing both of them. This is very important. And Venice, however, in this sense, being in the Adriatic Sea, was in a kind of a different situation. Because from one hand, there were the Adriatic Sea is kind of the gate for the Ionian Sea and the Aegean, so it was much closer to Greece and to the Byzantine trade as such. I mean, it was much more easily accessible. Venice also exploited this very important position that is also pretty close to Central Europe. So that Venice was always very important for the trade balance, also with Germany, with the Empire, the Western Empire, let's say. And it had it also in there. In this sense, Venice was mostly favored by also terrestrial situation, being essentially in a crossroad between the Germanic, the Slavic, the Italic, and the Greek world. Very importantly, this also, as we will see, what managed to rise. But also the Adriatic Sea was kind of more easily controllable, because actually there wasn't much of a maritime activity aside from the Slavic piracy at this point in there. The Slavs were not organized in cities like the Italians, but nevertheless they had, and it also had caused troubles to the Byzantines. And the Venetians, in this sense, were kind of the only maritime community in there that developed with a, were very, very good, also institutionally and structurally, and had this very, very ordered, especially political and military organization. Very differently from other Italian maritime republics, because Venice always maintained this degree of efficiency that you don't find in other cities. This allowed it also to recover quite quickly from certain defeats. For instance, once against Genoa, that albeit having kind of crushed the Venetian fleet in 14th century, they managed to. They were too fragmented, politically speaking, and eventually they lost once again terrain, or better, water to Venice. This, however, now we're still in the early times, and these were important, however, because they had this genetic moment of these political institutions. What happened also in here, as we were saying before, very importantly, is what happened with the Normans. With the creation of the Norman kingdom. After centuries of political fragmentation, arguably half of a millennium, basically southern Italy was all reunified, territorially speaking, Sicily and southern mainland Italy, under this big Norman kingdom. That was also very centralized for those time standards. I made just recently certain videos about the Normans of Sicily that are also another dramatically overlooked chapter of medieval history. It was one of the most powerful kingdoms at the time, and the most centralized in Latin Germanic Europe. And albeit all the problems naturally also the Norman kingdom had within its boundaries in terms of political unity sometimes, this was a very solid power that didn't know, in fact, kind of rivals in the area, if not the Byzantine Empire, that, however, was in the eastern Mediterranean, not in western, but were still clashing, among the others. And this, the Norman conquest kind of triggered so many things in this sense, because the Norman conquest brought to the stemming the growth of the southern Italic cities, because these were framed very quickly within the Norman kingdom, and albeit they never actually ceased to exercise their commercial functions, they could never develop these at the same pace of the political ones, unlike what happened with Venice. So this means that eventually even within the Kingdom of Sicily, these cities kind of flourished by certain standards, but they weren't doing it anymore because they were carrying out an autonomous policy, but rather because they were now framed into other economical dynamics, also related to the possession of, also to the interaction with the hinterland, and however were soon, let's say, choked also by the economical strengthening of the baronial possessions that also controlled naturally controlled the agricultural resources of the hinterland. So they kind of got choked a bit by those, a bit by the monarchic, by the monarchy, that also played, however, on them a little bit, on their autonomy, to counter the push of the barons. But as a result, let's say that even the Kingdom of Sicily as such, yeah, they definitely had a fleet on their own that was built by these cities, because just think at how important this was. We'll see it now, especially when talking about the role the Italian maritime republics had for the Crusades. But in fact, you see that even the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and its successors kept using, and began at least to use and grow dependent even on other on the ships, on the fleets of other Italian maritime city republics, namely Genoa mostly. So in this southern area of the Apennine Peninsula, the development of the maritime republics was kind of stamped. Venice, in this sense, kind of started, and together with Pisa and Genoa, they kind of began to take the place of these cities. And consider also that traveling by ship is, sailing is it's very fast. It also, what was these trades were so very important, so that they could now develop very quickly. It was not a matter of how much it took to reach one side or the other of the Mediterranean. It was really who was in the middle, who controlled the coasts, and who had the naval power to blockade. For instance, when Venice saw that the Normans had conquered southern Italy, they freaked out, because they realized that at that point the Normans, especially given that they were now expanding against the Byzantine Empire, and they could have choked the Strait of Otranto and blocking the Venetian trade with the Byzantines. So that's also what triggers certain political affiliations, what kept also the bond between Constantinople and Venice strong. So the Venetians expanded also between the 9th and 10th century against the Slavonic piracy into the Adriatic Sea, and by the 11th century, let's say that the trade, the net of trade interests of the Venetians extended between actually beyond Constantinople, up to the coasts of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and also in North Africa and in Sicily, because also the Venetians kind of trying to expand at this point also in this area between Libya and Sicily, that were that those were areas where they never kind of reached a very stable presence, but also were kind of expanding towards, in the sense, the Western Mediterranean, rather than and in addition to the East that remained, however, also obviously the most profitable trade route, because the major traffics were the Asian ones. And even though North Africa also had quite profitable trade routes that were exploited by others. And one of the greatest problems, how did Venice make a fortune, is that Venice also was kind of pretty, bold in what it was doing, because they were also selling the Arabs certain prohibited goods, including weaponry that, or however, other resources that could be useful to war, such as wood, timber, iron, slaves. Okay, these were coming chiefly from Istria, Slovenia, and Croatia. And that's where the Venetians seized all these resources. And now, since they got the upper hand in those, and naturally everybody was kind of worried, because these were basically, it was a major Christian trade power that was maritime power was trading with the Muslims, and Venice was kind of admonished and warned both by the Western and the Eastern empires, by the Pope, to stop this, but they kept doing it anyway. Basically, I think nobody ever besieged Venice. In history, it's a kind of an area that doesn't even make sense to besiege, because it poses such huge strategical and logistical problems and it's practically unsolvable. You can't choke it from the sea. This is true. But also that was difficult, and you took the naval power of other republics, like maritime republics like Genoa, for instance, and that also was not entirely effective. So those lagoons were practically impregnable. Even the son of Charlemagne had died of malaria trying to campaigning on there. Venice was kind of shaping itself as that enclave that objectively would remain as such up to Napoleonic times, and this major naval power in Europe that kind of kept doing it's very opportunistic policy. This is also very important to understand the kind of the politics of these republics, because, as we were saying before, these were chiefly interested into maritime power. They were not interested in expanded on land, for instance. Their main need was to make money to sea trade. And that's it. And objectively, what else do you need? If that's what makes you, more powerful, wealthier, better off. The Venetians made it, decided to expand into the hinterland just in basically from the end of, actually the beginning of the 15th century, to stem the power of Milan that at that point was growing, as it was instead practically an old terrestrial power that could sensibly, damage Venetian economy by seizing lands into the Venetian region, even inland, because Venice, however, was, albeit up to a certain point, it never kind of launched itself into this control of the of the mainland. They, however, had massive interests related also to the port traffics, to the salt mines that exist also close to Venice in this around the lagoons. So they had kind of this interesting, but their focus remained chiefly maritime till the very end. And this was a city built literally on the sea, by name and by fact. So this extraordinary history, actually, I haven't been told, I think I made no video about Venetian history on Schwerpunkt yet, but that's one of those chapters you absolutely need to know if you want to understand anything about the Middle Ages. So at this point, however, as we've seen, Venice was making a freaking lot of money with all this trade, now chiefly around the Eastern Mediterranean, and selling to the Arabs this timber, iron, slaves, and so on. But in the meanwhile, other Italian maritime cities were launching their own autonomous policy, and the main ones, as we've seen, were very soon Genoa and Pisa. Oh, by the way, I didn't talk about Amalfi much. That was a city, a maritime republic that actually fought always against the Saracens. Kind of, well, other cities, as we've seen, were kind of more dual in some ways. The Amalfitans fought always against this Saracens presence because simply they were the most powerful city republic and that maritime republic at that point in the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore they kind of necessarily wanted to expand, and they had to do it through, especially in the Western Mediterranean, through the Saracen piracy. Amalfi was choked eventually by the Norman conquest, so it took actually a while before it was completely subdued by the Normans. But it's albeit as an important trade center, it kind of began to decline. So in the Mediterranean Sea now, the gap that was left unoccupied by Amalfi was progressively filled by Genoa and Pisa, but also were kind of opening to other directions, because Amalfi also technically was more projected towards the eastern Mediterranean. Genoa and Pisa kind of began mostly in the west and also were oriented towards Spain, toward northwestern Africa. Then eventually they also, maybe also in parallel, but they kind of developed only from the end of the 11th century to be so intensely involved into the eastern Mediterranean as well. Also, which is something that for which the Venetians were quite troubled. And this is the real point, because it was these three main cities, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, that especially during the First Crusade imposed these real trade routes, basically developed on the east-west axis and vice versa, that united their linked their own ports to Constantinople into these mercantile colonies that these three cities had founded, since actually both in the Byzantine Empire and on this Syrian, Lebanese, and Palestinian coast. Thanks also to the backing of the Crusader princes. For the Crusader princes, the Italian maritime republics were vital, because they were essentially in this largely hostile territory, very far from their, from Europe, from their base of power. They always had troubles in having the resources. Objectively, certain powers like the Kingdom of Jerusalem were also relatively rich, but they had the need to, they had mostly a great potential. Now, one of the main problems with Crusader states was actually the sheer manpower for war, because not all Crusaders actually wanted to remain there. Some of them just came from time to time and came back to Europe when, after a few months of campaigning. So that was actually the real problem. But in general, there was also a problem of supplies, and also the problem of actually finding someone who could bring the Crusaders to the Holy Land. And these were the Italians. And all the Crusader fleets were made up by Italian navy, and the Italians were so crucial also for many other reasons, also because they had a great logistical and military engineering expertise. At this point, were actually the pioneers at this time in these fields. So, for instance, Jerusalem was conquered by the Crusaders in 1099, only because thanks the Pisans basically dismantled their own ships to build the siege towers, and eventually allowed the Crusaders to storm the city. So even Godfrey of Bouillon recognized this great Pisan fort. Naturally, there were also Italian Crusaders, Italian knights in there, but the city republics were kind of very different in nature in many ways. They also provided the bulk of other specialist troops like crossbowmen
most of the times, simply because they were the ones who were developing this quite fast, and were the ones who had the most intense contacts also with this very technologically developed Islamic lands. They had absorbed a lot of know-how and technical capabilities. So the Crusader states needed these Italian maritime republics to keep open the gate with Europe. And this is also why, for instance, certain Muslim powers that had not engaged into maritime warfare at this point, like Egypt, kind of began to build a fleet on their own. You know that the Muslim powers at this time, you know, every power at this point actually rarely had a permanent fleet. There was nothing like this. Actually, the only exception were the Italian city-states, because albeit the fact that there was nothing like a permanent fleet formally in there, at all times there were tens and tens of galleys that were present in the ports, in the harbors of these maritime cities, and therefore the commune, because these Italian city-states were actually communes like the others, simply they were just maritime centers, sometimes required the various families whoever owned these ships to say, okay, the commune needs this for war. And in fact, at this time was actually no real differentiation even in naval technology between kind of war galleys and cargo ships. I mean, yeah, there were certain typizations definitely, but this is something that mostly developed in the later centuries of the Middle Ages, also when the size of the traffics kind of increased. At this point, actually, those were the only powers who had a permanent fleet, together with a few others, like the Byzantines had, but also that was kind of intermittent. Egypt had not had these problems until basically the Crusaders invaded the Holy Land, and they started building a fleet to kind of harass the ports, chiefly Jaffa, but also others, to prevent the Italians to supply the main Crusader states. And this is also why along the coasts at this time, where this was actually the ships at this time sailed just along the coasts, there was a lot of naval warfare. With alternate fortunes. Sometimes the Christians won, sometimes the Muslims won, but the point is that there was also a lot of practice involved into these activities, and not just warfare, because as we've seen, the Italian city republics also traded extensively between during the truces, or also with other powers, extensively with the Muslims, and they kept doing it at all times. So we're just trying to make money, and what is also interesting here is that not that they were doing it for charity. In fact, they were essentially also competing the one with the other in the same Holy Land, in this same Crusader states. How? Well, there were tensions essentially that were born in the Outremer states by themselves. For instance, Genoa and Pisa were at this point fierce enemies. They had been competitors kind of since the beginning. It was a tradition. It kind of became also a proverbial enmity, and but this was not present at the very beginning. If we want to be precise, because there was a certain point to which these two cities had to emerge in the Mediterranean, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, to get rid and fighting against the Muslim pirates that came from Africa and the Balearic Islands. So these two powers had kind of stuck together, fighting. And actually, also, this is a very overlooked chapter, that basically most of Saracen piracy in the Western Mediterranean was basically annihilated by these two cities. So pretty harsh, intense warfare it was ferocious, really. It was based naturally not just on assaulting the cargo ships, but also raiding these coastal centers. That part of warfare is actually very, very fascinating. And the problem, however, is that the tensions between the two cities began when they managed to reach enough power to to determine which of the two cities would have had to establish its own hegemony on these, especially these major islands of the Western Mediterranean, of Corsica and Sardinia, that are just basically in front of Genoa and Pisa. And initially, actually, Pisa was more powerful than Genoa. Then eventually, Genoese kind of, for some reasons we'll see now, would increase their power and arriving even to defeat Pisa ultimately in 1284, and kind of making it the join, especially in their own trades. So also in here, the corporative dimension of these activities was present basically at all levels. And the enmity between the Pisans and the Genoese actually continued also elsewhere, both in Constantinople, where they had the various city-states had all their own quarters. They were in close contact one with each other, but also in Acre and Tyre. There were these two major ports of the Crusader world. In the Haute-Mer, and it was really a mess because these Venetian, Pisan, and Genoese quarters in all these cities were practically contiguous, so they were all in contact with each other. The local powers they had always been the same way. Also in other places, either Christian or Muslim powers were quite happy to allow the Italians into their ports, because these revived enormously their trade, but also they brought to kind of other kind of problems. Chiefly the fact that these Italian entrepreneurship was extremely aggressive. There was a lot of they could cause a lot of unrest practically because because they mostly fought also one against the other, so they could make a mess literally in the whole port, in the whole city, and engulf the whole trade in the process. Think of the distractions and so on. And the let's say that the presumption, the arrogance and prevarication and abuses of these communities were so high that were deemed to be intolerable in certain places. So to react, certain reactions against these Latin colonists, that broke out in true, bursts of xenophobia that brought also to the slaughter part of them, the imprisonment of them. And this kept going on. I mean, this was also a matter of seizing the riches that were stored in these in their quarters, which also a very effective way to cash fast, especially for from these powers that were losing kind of their grip on the Mediterranean traffics. This was done many times on certain by certain powers. The Byzantines did it. The Aragonese did it. The Aragonese were building also their own maritime empire. The French did it. For instance, also the Germans. Now that was mostly they were mostly terrestrial merchants, but they didn't want, for instance, the Italians to enter into the Baltic traffics because they wanted to exercise a monopoly over them. So also these so-called, because these were known mostly as the Latins, that in the Middle Ages there were these kind of terms like the Franks, the Latin, the Alemanni, there were also pretty kind of classical elitisms, this presence was also pretty turbulent, because objectively also these weren't just merchants. these were also marines, there was also sailors, there were people who technically had the chance to maybe seize the whole city. And very importantly, really at this point we have discussed it sometimes in medieval warfare, the majority of this the warfare was fastly evolving towards this the increase of siege warfare, of and there was a great expansionism, also certain powers in the Mediterranean. Think about this time, the Swabian, first the Normans, then the Swabian. So all this know-how, these ships, these siege engines, the crossbows, and so all things that the Italians were developing massively, and were such a huge resource. Because if you wanted to storm a big city on this point with fortified, now there were starting to exist the means to do it. So you needed these communities, and you also feared them because you knew that they could, being all concentrated and focused on their own individual profits, they could really become also pretty unreliable. You could control them with great difficulty. And also besieging the city, coastal cities, was very difficult because you had to besiege them both from land and from sea. So very often, not even the greatest terrestrial power of the time had such means, had such had the resources to commit themselves into such enterprises. So these cities were kind of doing whatever they liked, and very often changed the whole strategical balance both of Europe and the Mediterranean because of this. In the future, also, if you look at the 100 Years' War, all the Iberian navies, these were all essentially Italian ships, mostly Genoese in this case. There was a great need for also establishing relations with these powers, and also getting money, because at this point Italians were accumulating an incredible amount of wealth, and they were actively investing also in with loans and things. So the many wars at this time, also between France and England, etc., were actually financed, grow to be financed by these Italian traders and bankers. I made actually lots of videos about this now, but just to make you understand how you can't just say you can't just eliminate these communities from as a variable from the medieval system, because these were objectively the ones that made most of the politics and the economy going around, through their capitals, through their political affiliations, and so on. And this also caused much jealousy. Xenophobic attitude towards the Italians at this point was pretty much there, especially from the feudal world that was completely incapable, culturally speaking, of understanding the idea that such great power could be in the hands not of noblemen, but actually of commoners who weren't even professionals of war. And they despised, in fact, these. Even when they used them, they kind of had to picture them as a bunch of of cowards, of sneaky people. So there was also a lot of discrimination at many levels. But this actually was present at the time among all the communities. So it was pretty transversal. But still, behind this, it's very important to see from which relations also these ideas stemmed from. Are very important. So, as we were saying, the commercial colonies of these Italic cities rose within urban quarters that were well distinguished, the one from the others, and sometimes these quarters were even fortified on their own. So they were practically cities within the cities. They were always close to the sea. They always had an access to the sea, so their ships could be harbored in these areas. Were also very difficult to seize, because even if you control the city from land, from this quarter from the land, and still, it's difficult if you don't have ships on your own to blockade that specific quarter. So you understand, even these kind of strategical problems that, you need a lot of resources to fight against this. And especially in the east, you realize that there was practically no power at this point that could even go at the core of these powers to annihilate them. Because as we've seen from Venice was impregnable from land. Let's be honest about it. And these were over. So even if you knocked out maybe the Venetians from somewhere, you could be sure that the Venetians would have come back sooner or later with their own ships from northern Italy, and they would have made a mess in there. So also in here, these city-states had an enormous bargaining power. It was not actually based on this kind of deterrent, but really on the fact that their trade activities brought a lot of money with them, and so you necessarily needed them, because at this point it was a chronicles. The short of money was chronic. For every major kingdom or empire, so you needed them, and you needed to favor them, to give them these quarters, because otherwise you would have run out of money yourself. Sometimes also the Italians got burnt in this sense, because there were certain powers that became insolvent, they couldn't pay them back. The major banking crisis of 14th century Europe was largely due to the fact that the crowns of England and of France had become insolvent, so all the enormous amount of money was lent to them by the Italians could not be repaid, and this caused this kind of domino effect on all these market squares of Europe, because this chiefly Lombard and Tuscan banks have kind of failed, and this also contributed to the general crack of 14th century Europe. So all promise that make you understand how intertwined this European continent was in terms of economics and politics and so on, as always, by the way, at this point. So you have imagined these quarters to be naturally to possess the best portual infrastructures, warehouses, arsenals, and they were populated actually by these citizens of the motherland, of the Italian motherland, that spent actually part of the year from one side or the other of the other shore, the different shores of the Mediterranean. What is very fascinating also in here is how these merchants traveled, and how they were, in this sense, so aware of the world situation, also politically speaking. This is what you realize if you read an Italian chronicle at this time. You realize how wider the horizons of these people were compared to other places in Europe. They knew everything about what was happening in Europe, in the Mediterranean. Because they made a living out of this knowledge. This is knowing the market. So not just and this is a very profitable way. And very often these merchants kind of made affairs everywhere. They went back and forth in all the various corners of Europe, from England to Spain to Syria. All these, because all these traffics were so intertwined at that level. Some of these merchants also built, now we're talking specifically about the Italian Maritime republics, so about powers that kind of concentrated their into which economics was all one thing with politics and political and military affairs. But there were also certain land powers, like in Tuscany, in Lombardy, that eventually developed so much as well, we have seen. And they didn't have an army on their own. I mean, they obviously they had in Italy, but they couldn't move from there. So they kind of were civilians that went abroad and finding, and buying houses, I don't know, in London, in places. You find these streets of the Lombards, they were usually called this way, where they lived. But the maritime republics instead had this constant military power they could unleash on the coasts at all times. So they had also this extra kind of the other terrestrial powers kind of played with other weapons in the sense that also in their what was happening in Italy at this point could really reverse the tides in whatever was happening in Germany, in France, and so on. So they had other means to interfere in that sense, also through their military, through their through the political and military events that were happening in Italy, that at this time was being battled over, between either the Germans, and the papacy, and so on. So it was this complex. So what did they make so much money with? Well, the main centers at this point, as we were saying before, it was mostly the Silk Road that kind of allowed these huge fortunes, because the Italian trade colonies were mostly located in cities that were connected to other great mercantile centers of the mainland, like Damascus, Aleppo, and it could reach very, very far through the Silk Road, in fact, and up to that put in communication southwestern Asia with China. And from here to where it is, especially the most profitable trade was the one of spices, renownedly, simply because these were indispensable for medicine, for preserving food, and also for eating actually food, just also. And they were quite prized in Europe. Europe also had at this point a luxury market that especially the feudal elites were feeding, essentially. So these maritime republics were the ones who physically shifted all these goods from one side to another of the Mediterranean, making money in the process. But there were also other important products, also for manufacturing activities, also for art. Think about the colors that were used to paint, to dye the clothes that were eventually that were sewn into the West, but also in painting, in glass making. Also think of the manuscripts. The certain colors like deep blue came from the lapis lazuli of Afghanistan, and that is something you find also allegedly in what was the darkest hour of early medieval times. You find these medieval manuscripts in Western Europe that were with that blue. That point came only from Afghanistan, and from this you realize it was someone who was physically shifting those lapis lazuli and also working them and making them, creating material for creating the illuminations and so on. So just think how much was behind, how far also people traveled, and for just one reason, it is the profitability of all this. There was also a great interest in there was a lot of great export, a lot of trade in wool clothes, in hemp, and in also in other food products, and timber for construction, and also these kind of metal, kind of unrefined metal that was, and also the weapons that at this time were products that were increasingly there was an increasing demand for in the east, and were even always better paid. And it didn't matter how hard the popes tried with every mean, excommunication included, to stop the selling of these weapons to the Saracens by the Christian merchants. This trade continued, and this was all very, very important for the balance of trade at this point of the Mediterranean, because during especially the 13th century, the trade balance that had up to that point had either to be favorable to the east was inverted, thanks to the the arrival of gold within the into the trunks of the Latin merchants, and this is also the moment to which Europe basically could access to the minting of the golden coin, that between the 4th and the 3rd century had been practically been an exclusive privilege of the Byzantines and certain Muslim powers. So this gives you the dimension also how at that point monetary policies, also these trade bans based on precious metals and so on, was so dynamic, so vivid, and how this Europe was growing as a system and kind of getting on the lead. This point, I have to think even Italy in itself was becoming the greatest exporter of grain everywhere. I mean, the Muslim powers that were at this point even importing grain from Italy were at this point the Italians were really setting up a system that was to dominate essentially for centuries European and Mediterranean economy, for the sheer mass, of the sheer size of the volume of trade that they were able to put up. And this produced, as we've seen also, this massive growth of the European world. And if you wonder why the Renaissance was started in Italy, then that's because of all these huge amount of resources, of banks, of people who could finance artists, scholars, and could build this huge masterpieces, because it was all power. It was also a way to invest it, because once you build a church, that's objectively for your own city, it's a kind of an asset. So even art, and it's all something that at this point doesn't pop out magically from nowhere. This was funded by such activities. And I know it's bad, because many people today say, well, but art and beauty and knowledge, it's not something you can buy with money. Actually you can, and that's how, historically speaking, it's always happened. If you don't have a surplus that comes from a structural activity that allows you, that you can't have things like thinking, philosophy, literature, art, and many other things, and also much technical know-how, because also the technological advancements at this point weren't, were very more than else extensive, in the sense that there was objectively the availability of resources that at the time, that up to that time had not been present. So there was also a lot of, think about tools and weaponry, as we've seen. There were lots of improvements also in this field, thanks to the availability of new resources. So not necessarily actually of new technologies that were kind of naturally developing for kind of logical reasons of usage and so on, but it's really the sheer amount of wealth you could invest in things like war, for instance. This system was becoming extremely hyper-synetic. If you see how much even these Italian maritime states invested into the arming of their own war fleets, something enormous. we mostly like to concentrate on this, land powers, looking at how many knights, I don't know, a certain kingdom had and so on. But what was happening in the Mediterranean at this point was something amazing. Ships were quite costly, and these powers could field an enormous quantity, and basically they dominated the world Mediterranean, and consuming a lot of resources. Of these very resources fighting each other to fight over the same resources that were practically taking from their activities. So this brought naturally to many important choices of international politics, since these were dictated by the needs of navigation and trade. As we were saying before, the Venetians were not very happy of the First Crusade, and in fact they were opposed initially at it, because they knew that the crusade would have opened, especially for Genoa and Pisa, a certain opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean that up to that time had not been really much seen much of their presence in there, could compete with the Venetians. The Crusades also were naturally understand also the kind of geographical needs for this, because Genoa, for instance, was a very important port. I mean, not all the Crusades passed in the same places. The French, I think, privileged Marseille and Genoa or Messina. It depends. There were many itineraries, actually. I made a video also on this, on medieval trade routes, I think. Nets of communication, I don't remember now. But the important is that also the Crusades put in motion new routes that were chiefly maritime routes. So the First Crusade, for instance, was coming by land. By the time of the Third Crusade, nobody kind of saw that as a profitable thing, a convenient thing anymore. They all wanted to go by ship, and this also happened thanks to the development of these naval powers in the Mediterranean and what they had to offer. So there was a lot of, actually so many factors, because it wasn't just where the Crusaders embarked, but also where they went and what they did in there. Because if they destroyed a power was or they altered a balance in general that was favorable to one of the cities, that this was all intertwined, and naturally cities would fight for so many reasons that I think are some of the most important, some of the most fascinating aspects of medieval history. If you think this medieval world was kind of a passive thing where it was just the cities trading anonymously like this for no reason, just because they were on the sea, you kind of missed the whole sense of medieval history at the roots, because all of these powers were kind of constantly involved in kind of stemming the powers of others for their own benefit. And the world politics was down on this, and all the powers at this time were continuously in contact one with another. It was not something rare. Who believes that the Middle Ages was a point in which it took years even to know things? That's absolutely false. Maybe the peasant didn't know about these things, but sovereigns at all times in Europe had news traveling in a few weeks throughout the whole continent, and they knew basically everything what was happening. This brought to interactions that were extremely complicated, because now, even though our traditional blocks, especially after the Cold War, have kind of also talking about in terms of blocks is now kind of misleading in many ways in terms of strategical analysis and so on, but we still live in a world that is relatively stable. Just think of what it meant to live into, I don't know, the 13th century, a world that definitely was much slower as a system than our own, but that on the contrary was extremely more fragmented. So everything that you had in order to survive into it, you had to take into consideration basically every single factor that could play into the international scene. There was no I'm allied just with one and enemy with another point. This thing varied wildly and constantly. So even if this was a much slower world, generally speaking, it was much more dynamic. But the balance could change much more quickly than we think. And naturally, give also that there were many problems also within the public, the life of these city-states, because these weren't monolithic blocks that, especially if you take, city like Genoa, basically you realize there was no public authority in there. It was all about these houses, Genoese houses of noblemen that all kind of did their own business, and they constantly fought against each other. And just think at how this influenced, for instance, Sardinia was full of gold mines, and this was kind of the El Dorado of the time. Just think also the private initiative in all this, because this also mostly started through private initiative. It rarely was a matter of the commune saying, okay, let's go all together. There were sometimes just families taking in and going everywhere. And it's very funny because there was a proverb in Pisa, for instance, that sounded something like, citizen in Pisa and lord in Sardinia, because objectively these city republics had a very strong republican ethos most of the time, not because there was no prevarication and the people had such good moral views of politics and so on. It's simply because the distribution of wealth was much more homogeneous than in other places. So it was very difficult to prevail over the world system, because there were lots of other people who had resources on their own. So also this kind of idea of republicanism was very hypocritical under certain points of view. Nevertheless, it did work, because objectively it's from this republicanism that also much of what the concept of modern democracy stemmed from, because this was born through, also think about Florence, through the Renaissance. This idea of also, politics has always been an hypocrisy everywhere. But it's still fascinating also to look at the other side, in fact, and to see how these peasant houses, families, they went to Sardinia just like the far west, literally, and they could do what the hell they liked, building their own castles, living like lords, massacring the Sardinian populations, kind of exploiting them, seizing gold and so on, and then coming back into Pisa, just bringing all the gold back and making it invest in new naval power, in new private entrepreneurship, and new ships, and this is how the whole thing was basically fitted as a system. Also, naturally, the main routes were the ones with the east that were a bit more controlled, meaning that Sardinia was relatively a kind of a wide place. Now I make it an example because I remember the peasant proverb, but just realize that how even the internal policies were dictated by this interest. And part of the reason why these cities also became so unitary, if you take Venice was the most unitary of these cities. They had a system, and also by the 13th century kind of framed itself and basically remained not really unchanged, but it was extremely stable. Also in terms of political deliberations, it was a kind of great unity, because at that point it was about the community being all kind of involved, literally on the same ship. This metaphor is quite fitting, meaning that they objectively had to realize that the fortune of the city was in that case dictated by who prevailed, on the aims of the international traffics. In the case of Venice, maybe part of this thing was done because objectively didn't risk much from inland. Other cities like Genoa were kind of more open to the influence of other powers, also within the same city. Like there were usually much more split, because they also Genoa was kind of more accessible. Genoa was besieged, for instance, several times. It was occupied by certain powers, as which kind of it stayed flexible, and the reason why it survived also to become a major banking power into modern age is that they, in this sense, kind of were open to this. They realized also the benefits, paradoxically, of this open system, albeit losing a power, because this is the point. That Genoa became a massive banking power. Also, they were also massive naval power, but they didn't become a state that could wage substantial, for instance, even land operations like Venice did. Like Venice basically stood alone against the whole Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, and even bleeding it white alone. So that was the sheer size of Venice. That at that point was kind of proving how it had been able, through its political unity, to remain essentially the leading maritime power at that point in the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean at least, at that point. But let's say being kind of a unique city controlling an empire was enormous and extremely powerful. So it's that's why such topics are so fascinating, because they have so many different shades and so different aspects that I don't know how many people out there consider. I don't see much interest in this maritime republics. I think most of the people don't even know what they were practically about, so this is kind of a shame. Another problem that we mentioned about Venice was the creation during, let's say, was it Norman Kingdom of Sicily, because up to at least the mid 12th century, it seemed that this power wanted to control both sides of the Adriatic Sea by expanding on the coast of Epirus, and this was a trouble because the access to the Adriatic Sea would have been blocked. So at that time, objectively, you couldn't actually intercept a fleet effectively, but it still had to travel along the coast. So it also, the galleys had to stop frequently, because the owners had to rest. There was all these technicalities and so on. So there were so many problems posed by not having a stripe of land that you could basically stop to make landfall in, or at least it was under the control of someone else. So that would have been a great problem. Then eventually, the history of this, also in here I'm approximating wildly, because also the Kingdom of Sicily had so many different changes over time. The Venetians kind of sided at different times with or against, but generally speaking, at this massive, geographical evidence, usually the Venetians didn't like whoever controlled that trade between Italy and the Balkans. And they also were extremely worried by other initiatives, in fact, that sometimes were backed also by the Byzantines. For instance, in 1170, there is this famous siege of Ancona that was was another maritime republic on the Adriatic Sea. It wasn't so powerful like Venice, but at the same time it could challenge Venice in the control of the Adriatic Sea. And the Frederick Barbarossa was besieging this city because it was in this sense a very important center to control. It could give access partly to also to the east at that time, Barbarossa was making a kind of Mediterranean policy. So Ancona was very, very important as a strategical center, and at this point the Byzantines were actively backing Ancona and against the Germans, and they allegedly had agents in all the Italian cities at this time to kind of act against the imperial power at that point, while the Italian communes were fighting against Barbarossa. And at this point, the Venetians, that usually sided with the Byzantines, decided not to help them in this case, because they realized that Frederick Barbarossa was to wipe out her greatest rivals in Ancona there. So they wanted to let him do, because they knew that even if the Germans had ever won their war against the Lombard League and its allies, quite likely Venice would have remained kind of decentralized and autonomous and free, and would have still enjoyed certain benefits, despite Venice kind of generally sided also in here against the Barbarossa. The Venetians, I think, joined, or they however supported the Lombard League at some point, but having Ancona wiped out was definitely something they considered as more profitable. And this was all about the Adriatic hegemony, because that was really the main problem. Whoever controlled the Adriatic, and the Venetians were constantly looking at it so that nobody could extend its power in there, so not to contrast its traffics. At this point also, as long as the Normans kept this, that the Normans had from Sicily this kind of hegemonic powers of the cities of North Africa, and therefore especially the ones that were on the channel of Sicily. And at this point Pisa and Genoa kind of sided together in spite of their reciprocal enmity, because they feared that essentially at this time Venice was kind of expanding also towards those areas between Sicily and Libya, so they preferred to side also together with Barbarossa, hoping that they could practically avoid the block, the channel of Sicily, that had been this point of passage between the western and eastern Mediterranean. And this was very important because the Barbarossa promised to the Pisans and the Genoese great advantages in trade in southern Italy if he had ever conquered it. So all kind of balances that were looking at basically at the wall scenario, both the Mediterranean and Europe, because at that point arguably what Frederick Barbarossa was doing was the most important thing was happening in the West. I mean, trying to subdue the Italian peninsula and to eventually expand into the Mediterranean, because if they had made it, like the Swabians would have easily conquered Constantinople at that point and reunited East and West. So all these maritime cities were, hoping to carve their own space into this by, also chiefly against each other, because even, especially at the time of Frederick II, you realize that maybe at the time of his grandfather this was not so true, but eventually these divisions and so on were pretty much contingent. Also, this siding with the empire or the papacy was, for these city republics, really a matter of how much benefit they could gain personally from it. And when another bloc was getting too powerful, they were kind of stopping to support it. So sometimes this balance was kind of very definitely actually all the times were pretty precarious, insecure, and all simply because these were so many actors playing all together, and you didn't know what to do. But if at that time you needed to strengthen your force by immediately, because you were literally in trouble, like it was like at all times, you needed immediately to back that power. To maybe, if that power came to be too powerful, eventually to take away your support from it. So this was all this political measurement that happened at all times, and was so difficult to practically even foresee on the long run. So another major event of this period is naturally the Fourth Crusade, and the Fourth Crusade in this sense was can be framed within this clash for the hegemony over the trade routes. And the Fourth Crusade is actually pretty complicated. It's often very poorly explained, because it's usually explained by blaming who was who there that made the conflict. Actually, the situation was very complicated, and it's not even so obvious to tell the story as it was. However, it's pretty much obvious that whoever called the Crusaders in Constantinople, because this is also how it happened. It was the same Byzantines who called the Crusades to make that, because otherwise it might have also gone in a different way. It was all very kind of random in the way it happened. It was very obvious that the Venetians had all to benefit from this, and in fact with the fall of Constantinople they basically got 1/3 of the Latin Empire of Constantinople. The empire was created after the conquest by the French and the Venetians. And what you see in there is that theoretically, because that had been the deal, if the Crusaders had conquered Constantinople, the Venetians would have got 1/3 of it, given they were providing the fleet and so on, because the main problem at that point had been that the Crusaders didn't have the money to pay the Venetians for the shipping. So the Venetians kind of took this. First of all, they made the Crusaders conquer in Zara. It was also something relatively boring, because that was a Christian power. So they got paid in turn with this. Then they arriving to Constantinople, they decided that this was the share, and all the events that eventually led to the fall of Constantinople. After that, I mean, the Venetians had theoretically 1/3 of this whole land that the Crusaders would have given to them, because they also needed the Venetians at that point to remain kind of their privileged partners in the area. But the Venetians didn't give a damn about territorial expansion. They just wanted to control the ports, certain key passages such as the Aegean Islands, all the coasts of the Peloponnese were the major ports. The major, a better term can be the seaport. This logistical centers that could, favor the trade towards, the Constantinople and Cyprus and the Holy Land. So that's all they wanted. They wanted to control these ports that, as we've seen, also were pretty easily defendable. There were also so many, because Venice at this point owned so many different of these centers, and they also, how can you take them away from it? Because there is also this great problem in medieval strategies, that before you storm a fortified area, especially a city that can, or a quarter even, that can be supplied from the sea, it's a huge problem. Because if that's supplied from the sea, you don't have a fleet on your own. Basically, you can't take it. And just think, if these centers are tense and tense, how can you dislodge the Venetians from there? You can't. So the Venetians were extremely clever in the sense, and it's not because they were Venetians. I mean, it's because it was evident. Obviously, the Venetians knew much more about how this business practically worked, but the idea in this sense was to profit hugely from what was really, more convenient to do. The Venetians also were one of the few, actually, that in 1204 the city of Constantinople was practically destroyed. And you see, well, these crusaders were kind of burning, destroying everything, and not even know how to manage the city. The Venetians were the only clever ones who started taking away from Constantinople all the works of art, all the statues, all the precious things, because they were also able to, because they knew that they were actually much better acquainted to the Byzantine Empire than these French, most like French crusaders, and they had this knowledge of the area. And just think of this world, what it could be really, of relying so much on these ships that basically can't be opposed by other, if not by other city republics, and that you basically bet all your future on. And having this profit, just think of how obviously the situation was very difficult at all times for everybody involved, but think also the security this trade represented. It was really the best way to make money in that period in history, and that's the reason why these cities became so enormously powerful, so enormously well off, and how they managed to build, in the case of Venice especially, this empire lasted through the centuries, almost a millennium practically, with all its up and downs naturally, but it's a mindset really, it also maritime communities have a wholly different mindset from terrestrial communities. This is something you realize on so many levels, even in today's world. The sea is such a great mind opener in so many ways, and all this Mediterranean history actually deserves much more credit, because objectively most of what happened also in the European continent passed through what was happening here. Okay, let's pass to another element, that is the also what happened in Cyprus, that we mentioned before, actually from the end of the 12th century, because this became the seat, famously, of a monarchy that was basically held by a dynasty originary of central France and vassal to the Duke of Aquitaine. They were the Lusignan. And at this time, interestingly, this area was also under English control, because that was part of the Angevin, let's say, of the Aquitanian legacy of the Angevin dynasty and of England, and this new thing, because was this new power in here at this point was a new profitable market that was open for the Venetians and the Genoese. And at this point, the Venetian and Genoese started to fight very harshly for the monopoly on the trade in the new country. There was also, after the Fourth Crusade, definitely for the Fourth Crusade, Venice increased enormously its power, because basically it had now the whole control on Constantinople. At this point, Pisa and Genoa started to shift their traffics mostly on Egypt, especially the ports of Alexandria and Damat, and this is where they founded certain commercial colonies, also going against the papacy that at this point had forbidden the traffics with the Muslim world, at least during the period which crusades were on. And Egypt was a very important market eventually for these maritime powers, because it was a now it's complicated to explain, but let's say that it remained for a long time this major market for also for the Venetians later, and so on. Another very overlooked chapter in this is the Genoese expansion into the Black Sea. Now, when the Venetians had conquered the Aegean Sea, practically, let's say it was mostly from the European side, from the European shores. On the Asian shores were the Paleologi dynasty that eventually was to recover Constantinople at the end of the 13th century. That naturally was enemy with this French-Venetian system that had been formed. So Genoa saw fit to back the Paleologi and to basically enter to grant its service to them. And it is also largely thanks to the Genoese that the Paleologi made it to recover eventually the Byzantine Empire. It was naturally at that point a very different thing from what it had been before, because the whole system had collapsed. So, and the way the Genoese made it was basically to ask in exchange for their service the monopolium on certain islands. Chiefly, there's these centers like of Lesbos, of Mytilene. There is the alum that is very was used at that time, was very important also for the tanning, and these other operations are very, very profitable goods. Sometimes this was also these mines were extremely important also at that point, these precious resources, and so the Genoese managed to maintain a certain influence on the Aegean Sea. Now today we stop actually at the beginning of the 14th century, so we have no time to see how eventually Venice and Genoa clashed in those areas. But looking at Genoa, this is the moment in the 13th century in which they began, the Genoese began to expand in the Black Sea ports from the Aegean Sea. At this point, this was very profitable because the area of Crimea was now being invaded by the Mongols, and therefore the Tartars of the Golden Horde were kind of this bridge with the Eurasian steppes, from which part of the Silk Road, most of the Silk Road passed. So the Genoese from these Crimean bases could really absorb all the traffics now that came from that direction, and also to trade with the Russian principalities and think about all the mercantile flows that existed through the Volga and the Don rivers, and that also connected Crimea and Black Sea with the Baltic Sea. So this was also another enormously profitable enterprise that also made a freaking lot of money for the Genoese. Think about all the caravans that came from Central Asia and that arrived at the ports of Crimea. Think at Ukrainian grain that could also in this sense be imported in the West already at this time. So it's at this point Genoa was also expanding very fast, and actually at the end of the 13th century the rise of Genoa was sanctioned by these major victories they achieved respectively in 1284 and 1298. The one at the Meloria against Pisa, where the Genoese annihilated basically the Pisan fleet, and the defeat at Curzola or Curzola essentially in the Ionian Sea against Venice. That seemed at this first point that Genoa was destined to rise in the Mediterranean. And then eventually Venice was quite clever to exploit certain connections, also to ally with the Aragonese that at this time through Barcelona were rising fast. So there is the 14th century is marked by an extremely intense and extremely costly war. Another very important factor is to consider is that all these cities were practically also investing lots of their money outside the Italian peninsula. So just think about how these powers, how much they took away, for instance, from the military development of terrestrial from the development of terrestrial armies that at this time were also kind of declining in infantry, and so a whole world was changing. The case of Genoa would practically was very pragmatic, also in many ways could renew itself pretty easily. Eventually, with the defeat of Pisa, finally, this her great rival, they definitely achieved a major, very important status, like they were dominating the Western Mediterranean, and they kept. Actually, Pisa didn't after the Meloria battle didn't actually decline all of the sudden. The Pisans were probably the only maritime republic at this point that had a mainland district where they kind of were involved also for controlling certain terrestrial centers. So also in here, Pisa took a lot to decline properly, but at sea they realized they had no much of any other option but to side with Genoa. This was very important because even though they had been, these two cities had been so in competition with each other, now they realized that the balance, the strategical balance, made it useless. First of all, for Pisa to keep fighting against Genoa, but especially also the Genoese could at this point open to the same peasants many opportunities to keep them growing. So now the peasants were actually betting on the Genoese horse, let's say, and therefore backing it with their own capitals, hoping to earn from them. It was all a matter of how many interests you were, how many profits you could be able to do through this, and the Genoese were quite clever also to exploit their connections with Granada. That from the mid 13th century, the Iberian Christian monarchies are able to defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Las Navas. That brings basically the Christians to represent the hegemonic force into the Iberian Peninsula at this point, and the last Muslims will be thrown out of the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. But objectively, it's almost 250 years of Muslim presence in there, and part of the reason why, actually the main reason why this happened, is that the Iberian monarchies kept slaughtering one against the other, kept fighting once against the other. But also the Genoese at one point, especially to counter the naval power of Aragon, would back actually the Emirate of Granada. It was also pretty, it was a power to be reckoned with, despite now the Christians had the upper hand in the Iberian Peninsula. Granada was very difficult also to storm. In fact, it took this very big siege to take it eventually at the very end, and also thanks to the use of artillery and so on. But the point I'm making is that sometimes Genoese also opened certain other. They opened actually the Atlantic route. They were the ones that, when they were too hard pressed by the Venetians and the Aragonese, and couldn't, so that it was not profitable to keep insisting into the Eastern Mediterranean, if not for these colonies they had managed to get in the Aegean, in the Black Sea, and they kind of mostly invested into the Atlantic route with England, with France, with Spain, and also down, kind of putting the premises for the age of explorations, because actually the first explorations into the Atlantic Sea on the West African coast were founded by certain Iberian states, but actually the sailors were mostly Italian at this point, and all the crews and ships were mostly Italian production. I made a video, I think, of the fleet of the Kingdom of Castilla that takes into consideration this dynamic, and the what else? Another point. No, well, we can stop in here. Oh yeah, of course, I was about to forget that when the Pisans and the Genoese, because, oh, by the way, when the Genoese fought against the Aragonese, basically this happened also intermittently, because the Aragonese and the Genoese actually traded also extensively. This is kind of the general rule: war every once in a while, but trade to recover after that, because it was profitable for the both of them. And as we were saying before, at certain times in Barcelona, the Italian merchants were thrown out by the Aragonese because they wanted to seize their own power, then their own wealth, and then basically this went back and forth continuously. And while the Aragonese were enemy with the Genoese, the Genoese backed the Emirate of Granada, and so on. It went on. There is also another chapter going back in time. This is when Genoa and Pisa actually fought together into the Western Mediterranean to get rid of the Saracen presence, effectively. And at that point, actually, the Iberian Reconquista was, especially in the eastern coast of Iberia, was largely due to the Italians, in part because the also in there were pretty sneaky behaviors from both sides, actually, because the Italians took many castles along the Iberian coast at one point, and also in there was a lot of struggle, for who had to hold those castles, because originally the Aragon kind of said, okay, we will give it to you, then they kept it for them, so it was pretty complicated. But let's say that also that's a scenario that is often overlooked, and where actually also very interesting things happened. So anyhow, this is more or less what I wanted to say. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.